when the woman collapsed at the edge of Caleb Hart's fence, bleeding, barefoot, and staring at the ranch house like it was the last place left on earth. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from, and didn't notice the way the cattle went dead silent as if they recognized her before he did. Caleb had lived alone on the high desert ranch for 12 years, long enough to learn that questions led to trouble and trouble led to graves. So he carried her inside, stitched her arm, fed her soup, and gave her his dead wife's spare room, without ever wondering why someone would run that hard toward a place so far from everything. For 3 days she slept, waking only to flinch at footsteps and whisper apologies to shadows. And each night Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his rifle across his knees, listening to the wind scrape the walls and feeling an old fear stretch awake inside his chest. On the fourth morning she finally spoke in a clear voice, asking if the road south still led to Red Hollow, and when he said yes, her face drained of color as if he'd named a grave. She told him her name was Mara, that she would leave before sunset, and that he shouldn't have helped her, because men were already looking, men who didn't forgive debts or lies. Caleb told her nobody crossed his land without his say, and when headlights crested the distant ridge that night, he proved it, standing on the porch with his shotgun while trucks rolled past, slow and searching before disappearing into the dark. After that, something fragile settled between them. Not trust, but a truce, built of shared meals and unasked questions, and Caleb noticed things, like how Mara knew the layout of his barn without being shown, or how she winced at the sound of spurs, or how she watched him with a look that held both relief and accusation. He told himself it meant nothing, until a storm pinned them inside and she woke screaming from a dream, clutching his shirt and begging him not to make her say it, not to make her use the name, because once spoken it could never be taken back. Caleb almost laughed then, uneasy, because names had power only if you believed in ghosts, and he'd buried his ghosts deep under stone markers on the hill. But that night, as rain hammered the roof and thunder walked the sky, Mara leaned close enough that he could smell iron and sage on her breath, and she whispered a single word into his ear, a name he hadn't heard since the day the lawman dragged his brother away in chains and promised he was dead. The realization hit him like a rifle butt to the ribs, because the name belonged to a man who had taught him to ride, to fight, to lie to the law, a man whose betrayal had burned the ranch to bones and left. Caleb swearing never to trust blood again, and in that moment he understood that taking her in had never been a choice at all, but a debt coming due, one written years ago in fire, ending the quiet lie of his solitude forever. Outside, the storm eased, leaving the land holding its breath, while inside the house 2 fugitives from the same past sat awake. Knowing dawn would demand answers neither could outrun, Caleb loaded his rifle before sunrise, not to chase her away, but to face the name she had given him, and the war it promised to finish. He poured coffee, steadying his hands, accepting that mercy and revenge had just braided together, and that by nightfall the ranch would either be redeemed or erased. Mara watched him with grim gratitude, saying nothing, because both of them finally knew silence was over. The past had found them, and this time it would not leave anyone standing. Not after the name was spoken and not after the blood remembered. It always came back, and now it had teeth. Caleb knew the hunt had begun, and there would be no mercy. Left by noon, the ranch no longer felt like shelter but like a battlefield, waiting to choose sides, and Caleb could sense it in the way the wind shifted, carrying dust and memory together, as Mara sat at the kitchen table tracing invisible lines into the scarred wood, finally telling him what the name meant now. She said the man Caleb believed dead had not only survived, but built something monstrous. In the years since, a shadow network of traffickers, enforcers in buried towns, and she had been trapped inside it since she was 17, groomed to move money, silence witnesses, and vanish problems, until she learned a secret that made her expendable. Caleb listened without interrupting, each word peeling open an old wound he'd cauterized with isolation, because every detail matched what he already feared. The precision, the cruelty, the way loyalty was bought with blood and fear. When Mara said the name again, louder this time, it echoed off the walls like a gunshot, and Caleb felt the past snap into the present, remembering the fire, the screams, and the night his brother disappeared after promising to come back for him. He realized then that the ranch had never been spared by luck, only by distance, and distance had finally run out. Trucks appeared again that afternoon, Not on the road this time, but cutting across the scrub. Deliberate and confident, and Caleb knew they were no longer searching but confirming. He told Mara to pack only what she could carry, but she shook her head and said running was exactly what they expected, that the name's owner wanted her alive now, not silent because she had leverage, proof buried where even his reach faltered. Caleb asked why she'd come to him of all places, and her answer was a quiet knife. Because the man she was running from never stopped watching him, never stopped resenting that Caleb had survived when everything else burned, and because this ranch sat on ground soaked in unfinished business. As dusk fell, shots cracked from the ridge, not to kill but to test, splintering fence posts and driving cattle into panicked motion, and Caleb responded with precision, returning fire just enough to remind them that this land still bit back. The standoff stretched into night, headlights circling like predators' eyes, while inside the house Mara revealed the final piece, sliding a weathered drive across the table, saying it held ledgers, names, and evidence enough to collapse an empire, if anyone lived long enough to deliver it. Caleb laughed then, a hard sound, because he understood the trap perfectly. Protect her and invite annihilation. Turn her over and guarantee the ranch's survival at the cost of his soul. The name's men made their offer through a loudspeaker, promising safety, money, forgiveness, invoking family, invoking blood, invoking the past like it was a shared prayer. Caleb stepped onto the porch and answered with silence, then fire, shattering the speaker and ending negotiations before they could begin. What followed was chaos, bullets tearing the dark, engines roaring, shadows falling, and through it all, Caleb moved with the calm of a man who had been preparing for this, reckoning his entire life without admitting it. When the shooting stopped, the trucks withdrew, not defeated but satisfied, as if this resistance confirmed something they'd wanted to know. Inside, Mara pressed a shaking hand to her side where blood soaked through her shirt, and Caleb realized too late that she'd been hit protecting the drive. Protecting him. As he bound the wound, she whispered that the name would come himself now, that this had only been the opening move, and that when he arrived he wouldn't come as an enemy, but as a brother asking for what was his. Caleb stared at her, understanding the true cruelty of the plan, because if the man came wearing family instead of violence, the choice would be worse than any gunfight. Outside, the ranch lay broken but standing, smoke drifting under the stars, and Caleb knew the next sunrise would bring the past walking up his drive, smiling, demanding answers that could only be paid in blood or betrayal. He cleaned his weapon slowly, listening to Mara breathe, knowing that by dawn the lie of his solitude would be stripped away, and the name that haunted him would finally take a face, and when it did, one of them would not leave alive. He just didn't know yet which one deserved it more. The man arrived just after sunrise, alone, unarmed, riding up the long drive like he owned the dust beneath his boots, and Caleb knew before the face came into focus that the name had never belonged to a ghost, at all but to flesh, bone, and intention sharpened by time. His brother looked older, leaner, eyes colder, wearing a smile practiced for mirrors and betrayals, and when he stepped off the truck and spread his hands, the ranch seemed to recoil as if remembering pain. He called Caleb by the childhood nickname nobody else alive remembered, spoke softly about fate and survival, about how the fire had been necessary, how sacrifices had to be made, how he'd carried Caleb with him. Every year he built his empire, watching from afar, waiting for the right moment to return. Caleb listened with the rifle heavy in his hands, while inside the house Mara dragged herself upright, blood loss turning her vision gray but her resolve hard as stone, knowing this meeting was the end of all running. The brother asked for Mara politely, said she belonged to him, said family didn't hide from family, and promised that once she was returned, the ranch would be protected forever, untouched, immortal. Caleb almost believed him, because the voice still held echoes of shared nights and whispered plans, but then the brother's eyes flicked past him toward the house with hunger, and the lie cracked open. Caleb said no, a single word, and the brother sighed like a disappointed parent, explaining that no had never been an option, that Mara carried proof of crimes even he couldn't erase, proof that would destroy everything if released, and that she had chosen Caleb because the story would end cleaner if blood stayed in the family. That was when Mara stepped onto the porch, swaying but standing, drive clenched in her fist, and spoke the brother's name aloud, not with fear but with judgment, telling him she had already sent copies to places he couldn't reach, that the empire was already bleeding, and that this ranch would be remembered as the place it died. The brother laughed then, genuinely amused, and congratulated her, saying she had learned faster than most. But as he reached inside his coat, Caleb fired. Not to kill, but to end the performance. The shot tearing through the brother's shoulder and spinning him into the dirt. The silence that followed was vast, broken only by Mara's breath and the brother's soft, incredulous chuckle as he lay bleeding, admitting at last that he'd always known Caleb would choose wrong by his standards, that this was why he'd survived, why he'd been spared to serve as the final test. Sirens wailed in the distance, closer than expected, and the brother's smile finally faltered as he realized the trap had closed around him instead. Mara collapsed as the adrenaline fled, and Caleb caught her, holding her upright as lawmen crested the hill, weapons drawn, disbelief etched on their faces at the sight before them. The brother was taken away alive this time, screaming promises that sounded small against the truth finally spoken, while Mara was loaded into an ambulance, still breathing, still defiant. Weeks later, the ranch stood quieter than before, scarred but free, and Caleb sat on the porch watching the horizon without waiting for ghosts. Mara healed slowly, choosing to stay, not as a fugitive but as family by choice. And when letters came confirming convictions, collapses and endings, Caleb burned them without reading. The name lost its power at last, reduced to ink and memory, and the ranch remained, not because it was hidden, but because it had faced what came for it and survived. Caleb learned then that mercy wasn't weakness, that silence wasn't safety, and that sometimes the most shocking ending was not death, but the freedom to finally live without fear of what the past might whisper next.